Imagine this. Your country gets hit with a 30% tax overnight, not because of a war, but because of a president's political gamble. That's what happened to Mexico. But instead of folding, Mexico fought back. And what happened next sent shockwaves from Wall Street to Moscow. This isn't just a story about trade. It's a story about resistance, about dignity, and about how one nation turned the tables on the most powerful economy in the world. If you've ever felt bullied by a system too big to fight, this story is for you. When President Donald Trump proposed a sweeping 30% tariff on Mexican exports, he likely expected swift compliance, not open defiance. But Mexico's response was not just a rejection, it was a strategic declaration. The move led by President Claudia Sheinbaum stunned not only Washington but also markets across the globe. In her words, the United States was not offering negotiation, but demanding submission. Our economic sovereignty is not for sale. The fallout was immediate. Trump's trade war rhetoric, already aggressive, took on a sharper tone. Meanwhile, behind the curtain, BRICS moved with remarkable speed. Within hours of Mexico's public rejection, statements of support poured in from Moscow, Beijing, and Brasilia. Russian diplomats praised Mexico's stance as a dignified refusal, while China offered cooperation in infrastructure technology and defense areas long dominated by U.S. influence. To many analysts, it felt like a turning point. For years, the United States relied on economic leverage to maintain control over Latin America. Trade deal sanctions and aid programs were used like levers to pressure or reward. But Mexico's refusal showed that the old rules no longer applied. The message was clear. Latin America is no longer afraid of saying no to Washington. More importantly, it showed that BRICS is no longer just a talking club. With new members like Saudi Arabia and Iran and potentially Mexico on board the bloc, is building real political momentum. The power vacuum left by erratic U.S. policy is being filled, and quickly. Suddenly, the game changed. What began as a tariff spat over produce turned into a symbolic rupture of hemispheric loyalty. Mexico, long seen as America's obedient neighbor under NAFTA, is now exploring an entirely new alliance system, one where Washington is no longer at the head of the table. Mexico's bold move sparked something bigger than anticipated. It triggered a domino effect across Latin America. In a matter of weeks, both Cuba and Colombia signaled interest in exploring BRICS alignment. What had once been a whispered possibility became an open conversation. Was Latin America ready to break from the U.S. orbit? Cuba's motivation is clear. After decades of embargo and isolation, the invitation to observe the BRICS summit in Rio de Janeiro felt like vindication. For a nation historically excluded from elite economic dialogues, the moment was symbolic and strategic. Havana came prepared, offering proposals in biotechnology, public health, and food security areas where Cuba holds surprising global expertise. But Colombia's pivot raised more eyebrows. Under new progressive leadership, Bogotá has started questioning its automatic alignment with Washington. Its delegation to Rio advocated for a multipolar regional vision and greater integration with non-Western powers. This wasn't diplomatic theater. It was a coordinated message: Latin America is tired of being a pawn in someone else's game. Together, Mexico, Cuba, and Colombia began to resemble something Washington had long feared: a regional bloc challenging U.S. dominance. Analysts quickly dubbed it the Latin American Rebellion, a phrase once unthinkable in foreign policy circles. And with good reason. If these nations shift away from U.S.-led frameworks like the IMF or World Bank, and instead lean into BRICS alternatives, the economic ripple effects could be global. What makes this movement more potent is timing. With Washington distracted by election year politics and internal polarization, BRICS has found fertile ground for expansion. China, and Russia in particular, are seizing the moment, offering not just ideological support, but tangible incentives, infrastructure investments, energy partnerships, and reduced dependence on the US dollar. The stage is now set. What began as Mexico standing up to tariffs has morphed into a coordinated Latin American shift, one that might redefine global alliances for decades to come. Donald Trump's strategy seemed simple: impose, pain, extract compliance. But, in this case, the pain bounced back. When he layered a 17.09% tariff on top of existing penalties for Mexican tomatoes, an industry worth over $2 billion annually, he underestimated the collateral damage. The backlash came not just from Mexican officials, but from Trump's own base. In Arizona and Texas, farmers and distributors who once rallied behind Trump began to feel the sting. "We're shooting ourselves in the foot," one Arizona produce distributor said. "You can't replace Mexico overnight." The costs were immediate. Grocery prices surged, supply chains strained, and consumer trust eroded. Tomatoes became more than a salad staple. They became a symbol of self-inflicted economic wounds. But the economic cost wasn't the only blow. The political optics were brutal. Trump's message at rallies: "If Mexico wants China, they can have." China might have stirred applause, but it rattled markets. The dollar dipped, the peso surged, and quietly investors started redirecting attention toward BRICS-led infrastructure projects, especially those beyond the reach of U.S. regulatory control. Mexico's refusal struck a nerve because it was unexpected. For decades, U.S. administrations assumed neighbors would fall in line. But when President Sheinbaum said no and then stood her ground as BRICS embraced her move, the balance of power began to shift. Here's the irony. The tariffs designed to isolate Mexico ended up isolating the United States. American consumers bore the cost. Farmers in border states lost their markets. And long-standing diplomatic capital was burned for the illusion of strength. For a president who champions deals, this one backfired spectacularly. The U.S. wasn't just outmaneuvered, it looked out of touch. In a world racing toward multipolarity, clinging to brute force tactics seems less like leadership and more like desperation. The BRICS summit in Rio de Janeiro marked more than a diplomatic gathering. It was a strategic pivot. For the first time, Mexico, Colombia, and Cuba were granted formal observer status, sitting at a table long dominated by Western powers. And the message was unmistakable. BRICS is not just expanding, it is recalibrating the global power structure. Mexico's potential membership would be seismic. Economically, it's the second largest economy in Latin America, and a key player in North American trade. If integrated into BRICS, the bloc's combined GDP measured by purchasing power would surpass the G7. This is no longer theory, it's a statistical inevitability, but the implications go deeper than numbers. By offering strategic cooperation in energy technology and logistics, BRICS is laying the foundation for a parallel economic system less reliant on the US dollar, less vulnerable to sanctions, and more open to regional alliances. Chinese and Russian firms are already drafting investment plans for Mexican railways and telecoms. The urgency is clear. As U.S. influence wanes, BRICS is not just waiting, it is moving. And Latin America, long considered Washington's backyard, is becoming the front line of a new global architecture. In this landscape, saying no to the U.S. isn't defiance, it's an assertion of sovereignty. The world is watching. And more countries are beginning to wonder if Mexico can chart its own course. Why can't we? This is more than a political headline. This is a turning point in history. Mexico's bold defiance, BRICS's rapid embrace, and the ripple effects across Latin America mark the beginning of a global realignment, one that could reshape alliances, trade, and influence for decades. For American voters, consumers, and policymakers, the choice is no longer theoretical. Will the U.S. continue down a path of isolation tariffs and political brinkmanship, or will it adapt to a multipolar world where power is no longer centralized in Washington? Now we turn to you. Do you believe Mexico made the right move? Is this the rise of a new order or a dangerous unraveling of global stability? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe if you want to stay ahead of global shifts. Because this isn't just politics, this is the world rewritten. The world is shifting. What once seemed unshakable, America's influence in Latin America is now being openly challenged. And at the center of this transformation is a decision made not in Washington but in Mexico City. When President Claudia Sheinbaum rejected Donald Trump's trade proposal, it was more than a political disagreement. It was a signal that the global balance of power is entering a new chapter. One of the biggest lessons we can take from this moment is that alliances are not permanent. They are maintained by trust, respect, and mutual benefit. For decades, the United States assumed that countries like Mexico would always comply because they always had. But history reminds us that even the most loyal allies will seek alternatives if they feel disrespected or used. Mexico's decision shows that influence based on pressure and punishment is fragile. Real power comes from cooperation, not control. Another lesson is that economic decisions have emotional consequences. The 30% tariff on Mexican goods might seem like just another trade policy, but to farmers, families, and workers both in Mexico and the United States, it felt like a threat. It damaged trust. It created resentment. And it motivated people to look for new partnerships. Leaders often underestimate how policies are perceived by ordinary people. When a country's dignity is attacked, the reaction is rarely quiet. We also learn that multipolarity is not a theory anymore. For many years, the world was shaped by one or two superpowers, the United States, and to some extent the European Union. But now, BRICS is offering an alternative. It's not just a club of developing countries. It's a platform for nations that want to escape the financial and political grip of the West. And that platform is gaining members. If Mexico joins, it will give legitimacy to the idea that there is more than one center of global leadership. Moreover, the episode teaches us the importance of timing and momentum. BRICS didn't create Mexico's frustration, but it was ready when Mexico needed an option. China and Russia acted fast, offering support and investment opportunities. Brazil and India voiced encouragement. In geopolitics, being first to react matters. When traditional powers delay or hesitate, others fill the gap. BRICS understood the moment and seized it. From an American perspective, this story should be a wake-up call. The lesson here is not about blaming Trump or defending any single leader. It's about understanding the cost of transactional diplomacy. When foreign policy is based on threats and demands rather than dialogue and listening, it pushes partners away. Mexico's reaction was not just about economics. It was about respect, sovereignty, and pride. This moment also reveals the power of narrative. In many Western headlines, Mexico's move is described as risky or rebellious. But within Mexico and across Latin America, it's being celebrated as an act of independence. The same event is seen through very different lenses. This tells us that how a country frames its actions matters. Countries that control their own story can rally support and reshape public opinion, both locally and globally. Another key takeaway is how economics and politics are deeply connected. The tomato tariffs were not just a policy move, they were a political message. But the consequences were economic. Prices rose. Supply chains were disrupted. Voters in border states became angry. We often separate politics from daily life, but in truth, they are intertwined. When leaders make decisions, the ripple effects are felt in grocery stores, gas prices, and job security. We also learn that regional unity is becoming more important. Mexico's rejection of the U.S. deal encouraged other nations like Cuba and Colombia to rethink their own positions. Latin America, long divided by ideology and history, is beginning to explore what collective independence might look like. That doesn't mean turning anti-American. It means reducing dependency, building alternatives, and having options. That's a powerful shift. Lastly, this event teaches us that individual nations can create global impact. Often, we think of big powers as the only movers in world affairs. But Mexico's choice, a single decision, sparked conversations from Beijing to Brasilia, from Wall Street to Havana. In today's interconnected world, no action is small. Countries with clear purpose and strong leadership can punch above their weight. In conclusion, Mexico's rejection of the U.S. trade deal and its potential alignment with BRICS is not just a diplomatic news story. It is a case study in global transformation. It reminds us that respect matters more than power, that partnerships must be earned, and that the global order is more fluid than we think. It warns against arrogance and rewards those who are adaptable. And most importantly, it challenges all of us to pay attention not just to what nations say, but to what they do when the world stops listening to the old rules. Another critical lesson we must understand is that economic retaliation has limits in the modern world. In the past, tariffs were seen as effective tools of leverage. But in today's deeply interconnected global economy, punishing one country often leads to unintended consequences at home. The tomato tariff did not simply hurt Mexican exporters, it hurt American consumers, grocery stores, and small businesses. It proved that in an age of shared supply chains, isolationist policies create more problems than they solve. This is especially important for countries that still rely on export-driven economies. When access to the U.S. market becomes unstable, nations are forced to diversify. That diversification leads to new relationships, and in this case to BRICS. What started as an act of economic protectionism may end up accelerating the rise of an alternative trade system. Ironically, by trying to dominate trade negotiations, the U.S. may have encouraged the very alliances it hoped to prevent. The situation also highlights how internal political strategies can damage international trust. Trump's hardline rhetoric may energize certain voter blocs domestically, but on the world stage it creates fear and resentment. When national leaders blame foreign countries for internal problems, whether it's immigration, drug trafficking, or economic hardship, they risk turning partners into opponents. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. We also learn the importance of listening to smaller voices in international politics. For decades, countries like Mexico, Cuba, and Colombia were treated as secondary players in global decision-making. But these smaller voices now hold strategic weight. They control resources, labor, trade routes, and increasingly narrative power. The global South is asserting itself, and their choices will shape the next era of global cooperation or confrontation. In that same light, we learn that regional alliances can become global influencers. BRICS started as a loose group of emerging economies, but it's evolving into something much more counterbalanced to Western hegemony. As more countries express interest in joining or aligning with BRICS, the bloc's influence will grow not only economically, but ideologically. This creates a new global conversation, one where former assumptions about who leads and who follows no longer apply. Another valuable takeaway is about resilience in the face of pressure. Mexico could have accepted the deal to avoid conflict. It could have bowed to the pressure, absorbed the tariffs, and continued business as usual. But instead, it chose principle over convenience. That decision inspired other nations, sent a strong message about sovereignty, and earned international respect. Sometimes, taking the harder path leads to deeper, long-term gains. There's also a broader cultural and symbolic lesson here: symbols matter. Tomatoes may seem trivial, but they became a powerful image of economic tension. A 17% tariff on a fruit turned into a symbol of political overreach, economic miscalculation, and public backlash.